There are worlds out there where the sky is burning, where the seas sleep and the rivers dream. People made of smoke and cities made of song. Some of there's danger, some of there's injustice, and somewhere else the tea's getting cold. Come on, Ace, we've got work to do.
Hello, and welcome to Too Broad and Too Deep, a podcast about the Doctor Who Virgin New Adventures from Timewyrm Genesys to the Dying Days. I am Anthony Carroll, and with me is...
Alasdair Shaw. Hello.
Hello, how are you doing, Alasdair?
Oh, I'm cursed in technology, Anthony, but apart from that, grand. How's yourself?
I'm not bad, I'm glad we thankfully got there, as it's been a pile of effort to try and get the technology to work for this. But thankfully we're there now, at least.
Yeah, we got there.
So, yeah, I guess this podcast is just going to be about the Virgin New Adventures from the 90s, 91 to 97. I wanted maybe actually just to kick off and find out how you first maybe got into it or heard about them in the first place.
Well, sadly, I'm old enough to remember them coming out the first time round. Although, in my defence, I grew up in an island and then a small village. So we didn't get an awful lot of bookshops, and I was still waiting, pre-internet for the most part, I was still waiting to find out when the series 27 of Doctor Who was coming out. Hadn't quite given up hope by that point, and I came across Love and War in John Menzies in Glasgow, which gives you an idea of how long ago it was, because it wasn't W.K. Smith's yet. And I looked at it, I was tempted, I was Lee Sullivan in the cover, it's hard to go wrong, Paul Cornell writing it. It was, unfortunately, I looked at it, realised it was book 9 in a range, and the previous books were a quartet and a trilogy. I thought, I'll maybe come back to that. By the time I came back to Glasgow, because we didn't come to Glasgow very often, because the city was a scary, scary place to village folk, there was a lot more of the books out, and it seemed too... Well, the same reason people avoid it just now, it just seems too much of an effort. By the time I became fully aware of it as a danger, that it was now replacing the TV series, I thought it was too far in for me to catch up at any decent rate. So I relied on my local library in Johnston for catching up with the books, and they did not get them in very often. When they did, it was mid-arcs and just bits and pieces. And believe it or not, the first one I read properly was The Dying Days. Up until then, I contented myself with the Targets and a couple of the Missing Adventures and such that came up. But for the most part, the first proper new adventure I read was The Dying Days.
It's quite a good jump on point for people.
Given we're both big fans of the Seventh Doctor, the first NA I ever read was the one with the Eighth Doctor in it. It was but there was a huge push at that time because the TV movie I just aired, there was a bit of a revival. There was talk about this being the new series and moving on. So I read the book excited to read it, but at the same time thinking, well, this is obviously going to finish now because we've got the series back. And it was a wee while before we realised that, no, we don't have the series back. It's just going to be that one movie.
I mean, you were correct in one assumption. The range did end. It just didn't mean that there was going to be a TV show.
Aye, because the BBC took it back in-house shortly after that, and the 3 days are a different thing altogether. There's other podcasts you can listen to, folks. We're all about the Hennies here.
Exactly. It's all about the Virgin New Adventures here for now.
Yeah, so annoyingly, I read The Dying Days, had a copy of it in my hand, and handed it back to the library. And even with the library markings, I didn't think how much it's actually worth now.
Yeah, Johnson's library could have done without that copy. You could have got more use out of it compared to them.
Oh God, aye, but I read it again a few years, but after that, because the BBC had that and Lung Barrow and Human Nature up on the website for the longest time, completely whole new set of illustrations. So I really got into it when I discovered that there was Doctor Who fandom online. And I started going to things like Forerunner of Gallifrey Base and the Doctor Who reference guide and realising that, it's not actually that much, it's not that big a section you can't get into it. The problem was getting hold of the books. That remains a problem to this day. And we both know there's ways it means to get hold of the books and read them if you really want to. It's getting hold of actual physical copies of the books remains tricky. There's been a few reprints over the years, but even then the reprints that they do are like Human Nature. And I got a reprint because they made it into an actual Doctor Who episode. But if you're reading the books, though, it comes in the middle of an arc. was it just Human Nature they did for the Seventh Doctor?
Yeah, that was the one that they chose for the BBC book style reprints
Yeah.
that they were doing compared to any other. And yeah, I mean that's one of them. Not to say that was the one that got me into the range, but it was one I picked up a while later after the first one I picked up, because spoiler alert, the first one I picked up was Timewyrm Genesys,
Oh, right, interesting.
which is why I did not pick it up for another few years. Uh, but I did find that Human Nature book when they reprinted with BBC Books, and I read it, and I love that story. I love the Human Nature story, but in terms of its continuity, like how it begins at the beginning with this sort of kind of marketplace, and Benny is there. I was like, who is Benny?
Yes.
All of this sort of stuff kind of came into it, and I can see how that might not have worked for folk, especially during the context of having an actual TV series on, to suddenly see this book mid-flow into its own range in the 90s.
And that's always going to be a problem for new adventures. And if you want to start at the start, you start with Timewyrm. And Timewyrm's, to just get that out here now, Timewyrm's not great.
That's the thing that I was going. Yeah, the main thing I think everyone would be thinking about with this range is, how do you start off a book range of Doctor Who in the first place? And I think Timewyrm Genesys is a good example of how not to start a book range, or indeed any range about Doctor Who. Like, we even think about the TV series itself and how Rose is a fantastic catch-on point, and since then they've done lots of good catch-on points for folk to join that show. If you were to do that with the books, and if you were trying to bring in readers into the Doctor Who world, this book would not be that, I think.
No.
It's
Give John Peel his due. He does try to do that. He has the whole Ace is lost for memory. Let's learn who Ace is together. And
yeah.
I can see what he tried to do, but it didn't really land.
Yeah, exactly. I guess just before we go into the book itself, I guess in that way, John Peel as a writer as well, he's not done too much. I don't think he actually did any other Virgin New Adventures, but had you had any experience since then reading his stuff? I know he did the 2 Eighth Doctor Dalek books and such.
He tends to be Doctor Who or Doctor Who adjacent. He did a couple of targets that were pretty well received. I think it was the Dalek's Master Plan. And when given his own story to work with, and he can put bones on it, he does absolutely fine. But in his own words, he wanted to be the first person to write a completely original Doctor Who novel. And that meant writing at speed and getting it out. And reading through Bookworm by Anthony Wilson and Robert Smith, they think it reads as if it wasn't proofread. It reads as if it was spell checked and then put out.
I think some of it is not spell checked, and there's some very interesting spelling errors in it.
Even the book cover of it, Anthony, was Genesis with a Y. I've yet to come across a decent explanation as to why Genesis has got a Y in it.
I think there was some form of logical reason about it being Yodi sort of typing, but even then, it's a bit pretentious, and coupled with the actual spelling mistakes that are kind of laced within the book, it doesn't give a good logic towards it being properly proofread. So I guess maybe just to talk about what this book actually is for Timewyrm Genesys, I'll just read the blurb and we'll see actually how close this is to what we actually see in the book. So this is what the blurb says on the back. Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization. In the fertile crescent of land on the banks of the rivers Tigris and Euphrates, mankind is turning from hunter-gatherer into farmer, and from farmer into city dweller. Gilgamesh, the first hero king, rules the city of Uruk. An equally legendary figure arrives in a police telephone box. The TARDIS has brought the Doctor and his companion Ace to witness the first steps of mankind's long progress to the stars. And from somewhere amidst those distant points of light, an evil sentience has tumbled. To her followers, in the city of Kish, she is known as Ishtar the Goddess. To Doctor's forebearers on ancient Gallifrey, she was a mythical terror, the Timewyrm. yeah, there's some interesting ideas perhaps within that blurb
Yes.
that are not explored. Um, I guess this is set in Mesopotamia and such, but how is your Mesopotamian knowledge in terms of the legends of Gilgamesh and such?
Not great. I've limited to Marvel's Eternals, and that's about it, really. It's not fantastic, but I don't think you'd have a firm grasp of the history to realise that this book is mostly based in the history. My only other reference for Mesopotamia, and I'm saying that wrong, I'm very sure I'm saying that wrong, was when the 11th Doctor mentioned it in Day of the Doctor. He talked about a week in ancient Mesopotamia. That only really hit for me when I was reading it for the second time, and it's like he spends a week travelling across it, and it's like, did Dave reference this in Day of the Doctor?
Yeah, it's an interesting, again, to talk about how you'd start a book series like this. I don't know if Mesopotamia is the place you would go to first and foremost to start a new rip-roaring adventure. There's one idea I do like about this, and it's mentioned in the blurb, but it's not really mentioned in the book itself, is this idea of it says an equally legendary figure
Yeah,
arrives and so I was like, oh, we might see comparisons between Gilgamesh and the Doctor, but also in terms of because they have a companion as well. So Gilgamesh has is it Enkidu
yes,
is a sort of Neanderthal companion and Ace as
yeah.
well, and so there's an interesting parallel there. But again, it's not in the book really.
No, there's a few nice references to it when Ishtar goes, "Oh, I've heard of the Time Lords or mythical creatures," and it's like, that's a really good idea. Mythical creatures who have themselves got a mythology, and the Doctor's part of that mythology. There was parallels there for the taking, and John Peel was just going, "Yeah, that was a thing. Move on."
Yeah, it's all very surface level of stating that, but not
Yeah,
using it, not delving into that, or making any sort of interesting yarn out of it. In particular, for me, that kind of Gilgamesh Doctor kind of parallel, which they could have done because of his adventures and how he's in mythology, this boisterous kind of adventurous person, and the Doctor as well. There's no comparison of that. There's no conflict between the two because Gilgamesh is this sex-driven
oh,
like brute, whilst the Doctor is not quite that. But there's no conflict of that. In fact, it's the opposite of that.
yeah, because Gilgamesh is, they say he's one dimensional, to maybe flesh him out a bit more than John Peel did. There's no substance to him there. He's a one note pervert character, and I'm led to believe that Gilgamesh did some great things and was quite pivotal to history, but there's no trace of that in this book
Hmm.
at all. And even the end
Yeah.
of it, when they're talking about how all this will be written to focus on Gilgamesh, there was a line begging to be used. Oh, I wonder if there's a version of the story here where the Doctor's the central character. It's there for the taking.
I mean, that's the thing. To be honest, Gilgamesh is such a unused character in this. Like he has no agency within the story. The only slight amount is how Ishtar is slightly spurned by him at the beginning because he doesn't. And this is another thing as well, the sex politics of this book
Oh,
because he says, "Oh well, you're not a woman, so I can't have sex with you, and you're not a man, so I can't fight you, so I'm not interested in you." And it's a bizarre idea that this book has, and you'd think that's constrained to Mesopotamia, but it's not really. That this sort of sex politics is driven throughout the whole book in all
oh,
characters, and I guess we need to talk about that elephant in the room about how horny this book is in such a
oh,
creepy way. Because imagine you are, like we've been saying, someone who's heard about Doctor Who, and you see this on the shelves, and you're like, "Oh, that's that show that was on maybe 2 years ago. I'm gonna buy that book and see what it is." You get in 20 pages in, and your first interaction with the TARDIS crew is the companion in the Scud waking up and trying to go through remembering who she is and such. But there's lots of detail about her trying to get dressed. And it's like I don't remember that happening in Doctor Who. It's such a odd
oh,
idea, and to be honest, fantasy that John Peel has about in particular women he has in this story, and starting that off with Ace was bizarre.
Oh, it reads like it was written for a teenage boy by a teenage boy. There's just no art to it whatsoever, and it's. I mean, we touched this before, just before we started recording. There's so much involved in this about talking about seeing things through the lens of the time, but there was no need for Ace to be naked waking up.
It's a thread that he consistently has, and like you say about this being a teenage idea about being adults, basically. This is continuing throughout it, including what you were saying about the Doctor saying, "Oh, this is part of the time period," and it's one of the key issues I have with this is it's about. In fact, I have written the exact page number because it struck me so much when going through the book. And it's at page 119, page 120 of this. Ace is talking about how Gilgamesh is such a brute and such a leech, and in terms of his sexual desire, because he's been having scenes in this book already of like fondling literal teenagers in this book.
And not even mature teenagers, it was like 13-year-olds. It's like,
yes. Like, it's one thing, because I believe in the mythology of Gilgamesh that is explored about how people have had enough of him just being an absolute, like, sex maniac, and the companion that he now has with Enkidu is sort of there to basically distract him into the world and adventures of fighting other men and all this. But that's not brought into the fore of society in this society, knowing that this is a bad thing that he's doing. It's only just viewed through the lens of jealousy by his wife. It's not viewed through the lens of this is a creep. To the point that the Doctor does not challenge this, and that's what happens in this wee bit here, where Ace is saying that doesn't seem right to me, but the Doctor says, "Oh, I didn't say it was right, Ace, but in this culture, it's considered acceptable, and we just need to be more accepting, basically, of this culture." And this idea from the Doctor saying that is absolute opposite of where this story should be, because, like we were saying about the Doctor and Gilgamesh being kind of parallels, this is the fork in the road you could make by going, the Doctor stands up for a more decent society, whilst Gilgamesh is an absolute perv. But we don't get that. The Doctor actually kowtows to it.
You could maybe just about get away with it if it was painted as consensual sex all the way through. Just about. Not entirely, but just about. But there's talk of rape.
Yes.
And it's thrown in almost, oh, and by the way, he rapes some people. It's like, no, I don't care what point in society you're in. That's not okay. I don't care what the age limits were. I don't care what society said. I don't care about anything else. Rape is wrong, regardless of the lens. And it was worrying that a book was put out with a BBC property that went, actually, it was okay back then. Because that's a slippery, slippery slope.
Exactly. And it's something painted so early on. It's in page 24 where he talks of folk within the Citadel in Atum who talks about this, and how it's multiple times that the wife is raped, and to then have Gilgamesh painted not as this villain in a way that he should, and for it to be brushed off by the Doctor is exactly like you say. It should not be where this book should be aiming to be. There should be this diverging line between these two strong characters in this book, and yet we don't get that.
Yeah, there were several kind of moments as I was reading it. It's like, did I really just read that? Is that? No, surely not. But it's there. The only thing in its defence is they paint Gilgamesh as being typical of his time, but he seems to be the only character doing all this. And I didn't quite enjoy the storyline where his council are basically sending him out spy missions that he doesn't have to go on, just to get him out of the city for a while. Once again, that plotline seems to come up and then disappear very quickly without being followed up on. There's numerous plots against Gilgamesh, but we never find out how they end.
Exactly. It's also it's one of the plot points down the line as well that the Doctor actually actively uses as well, because he uses a young girl who's, I think, 13 in this story to basically pretend to be a prostitute again after escaping prostitution to come out and help them go through this temple. And for the Doctor to do that as well, it
Yeah,
enables this culture in such a way that it does not draw a red line on this. Yeah.
well, they should. But the internal dialogue at that point has the Doctor complaining to himself, why would she get her breasts out to help us?
This is meant to be the way in for folk to a new era of Doctor Who in book form, and this is the content they have the Doctor doing.
It reads, and it couldn't be because it's too early, but it reads like somebody's read Game of Thrones and wants to do a fanfic based on it. And it's
It
just,
is that sort of adolescent way of approaching kind of mythology and such that absolutely doesn't work when you're trying to meddle in a kind of basically children's type science fiction show as well. That combination to me doesn't
it's just
work. I mean, we have had examples in the past in the show itself of where the Doctor conforms to that society in some way, like
yeah,
say in the Crusades, where like Joanna is getting married off to Saladin, I think, and the Doctor doesn't tell her about it because it's a plan by Richard the Lionheart and such like this. But he still has remorse about it. He still has a conflicted argument about it with companions, with people. In this, it's just the Doctor has no qualms about conforming to the society in that way. And it's kind of concerning for this Doctor in particular, for the Seventh Doctor, because I guess that's one thing we should maybe discuss as well, is how did you find the Seventh Doctor and Ace as their characterization compared to what we've seen before on TV with them?
Ace wasn't terribly off, apart from the whole, oh look, I'm naked. But her kind of attitude, her bolshy nature and calling things out as going, well, this is just wrong, was fairly close to how I remembered Ace. I wasn't too upset about that one. But the Doctor, this is not how I remember the Seventh Doctor. It's callous and here's the thing. We do know with On in the Line he does get very, very manipulative and controlling. But he wasn't the Doctor to me, Anthony. He just didn't feel like the Doctor. Especially complaining about women not being naked enough. It's like,
Yeah. And the way that he treated Ace as well, to be honest, for me, especially near the beginning of winning in the TARDIS and such,
quite dismissive.
there's a feeling about the Doctor in that area in particular around the TARDIS scenes near the beginning where he's just so cold, he's so bitter towards her and antagonistic unnecessarily in a way
Yeah.
that just fits basically a Colin Baker Doctor compared to this, and it almost reads like John Peel's sort of disdain for this Doctor in a way that he is intentionally almost writing him in such an arsey way.
How it struck me was Douglas Adam once said you can only change the Doctor 10% at a time. I know there was a plan for making this Doctor Ace fall out and for a divide to come up. And I got the impression that John Peel read the series Bible, read the long-term goals and went, right, well, I can do that in 5 pages. What would take a whole life for doing this with? When the last time we saw Doctor and Ace, it was, and someone else's tea is getting cold. Come on, Ace, we've got work to do. And they go off, not hand in hand, but they go off, sense of camaraderie, togetherness. She's accepted the Doctor as her family, the TARDIS is her home. They are a unit. They are two people going off to wage war against all who's wrong and indecent in the universe. And for them to go from that to this is just, I don't think jarring is strong enough a word. It's just, no, this is not who we led. This is not Ace and the Doctor.
Yeah, and you'd think someone who has revelled in Doctor Who mythology and continuity, because there are many references towards the classic series, that you'd think the characterization would stick with such a writer to be able to continue that, but it's more so the factual, or towards some of them infactual references that he makes rather than the actual characters that you would think would stick with him in the writing, and that's kind of the disappointing thing, I think, within that key relationship, because yeah, you can have a conflicting Doctor and Ace, and they do have that in a more balanced way down the line, but this it's just going hard, too strong, absolutely out of nowhere, to try and, like you say, just hit all the things that you might want to do in an arc within the first book, and it doesn't work for me in that way. And I guess one thing as well, just to tie into the Seventh Doctor and my idea that John Peel has this disdain for the Seventh Doctor is the resolution to this. Now, there's a scene within the TARDIS. There's a bomb, cobalt bomb is connected, I believe, after Ishtar's within the TARDIS, and somehow the Seventh Doctor cannot do this, and so he has to revert somehow and call the spirit of John Pertwee to somehow resolve the plot. And if there's ever been such a dig at a Doctor who we are meant to be following as the current Doctor, is to call in another Doctor to do the resolution because you don't think that Doctor's capable enough. It just is such a dig at that Doctor to me.
I would love to argue with you because it's got the germ of a good idea, and the fact you can maybe call up different versions and different skills. I mean, when you saw the bother I had getting logged into this in the first place, me back in the 90s would have absolutely been not a problem. I could get my head around IT absolutely fine, but it's a strange land to me now in the 2020s. But it wasn't explored like that. It was just, oh, I'm not good enough. John Pertwee was. And I'll show you his John Pertwee because he'll say, jump in Jehoshaphat an awful lot and keep rubbing his chin and call everyone Liz and Joe. And
it's a frustrating way to resolve a story where, again, you're meant to be introducing this Doctor potentially to a new audience in the book form. That you have to rely on a character, like an older version of that character, because you feel this one's not capable enough. It doesn't give confidence into the character you're wanting to project to your audience in a new form with a book line.
No, and everything we've seen about the Doctor and multi-Doctor stories suggests that they're of very similar minds and experiences. Even just recently with the giggle. I mean, some of the best parts of that for me were when David Tennant and Ncuti Gatwa said the same line at the same time. Even the same intonation, it's just like highlighting this is the same person. This isn't different face, same person. Different hardware, same software.
It is frustrating sides, but yeah. I guess one thing to try and be positive about about this series is the titular Timewyrm. I actually quite like how the Timewyrm is within the book as a villain, and some of the lore behind it as well, in terms of where they've came from their home planet, and how that society tries to deal with and helps to resolve the situation. What did you think of the Timewyrm itself in this form, firstly, before it goes into its next evolution, as it were?
Ishtar, or was it Qatar they called her at first?
Ishtar is the name she takes when she's in Mesopotamia.
She had a different name again when she was in Anu, didn't she? It was Qatar or something like that.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm very quickly looking up. Glancing over Bookworm very quickly, and already I've read the word breasts 3 times.
Quataka.
Quataka, thank you.
Quataka was the name of Ishtar, yeah.
Yep, so even that, various names. They could have played an analogy in there. The Doctor's got several faces, he's known as different things in different worlds, but no, we're just going to thread this in. She was very villain of the week for me, up until she got implanted into the TARDIS circuits. And that's where things got interesting for me, where she basically hijacked the TARDIS, nicked part of it, and became a whole new creature. She's essentially the TARDIS Part 2, Next Generation almost. It's a novel idea, and I think one I'd like to have seen a different author tackle. It felt very much like an afterthought. It's like, by the way, John, this is what we need to have by the end of the book.
Yeah.
You need to give Uncle Terence something to work with. Here's how it's going to finish. It didn't feel like one of his ideas, because it felt quite fresh and innovative. And it's like, no, that's not him. That's not the guy we've just been reading for 200 pages.
I guess for myself, Ishtar as a villain, I did actually quite like her plot, her idea of what she was going to do, how she controlled people in this place, and her feelings about, you know, how frustrated she was to be in such a backwards area in her mind compared to the level of civilization she's used to. I guess, yeah, like you say, it's similar to, I don't know, I would maybe call John Peel kind of the Richard Martin of books in this way. He tends to be turned up in a lot of Dalek stories, and then he's not actually that good at what he's doing. And when he does have another chance at something, he's a bit ropey, and there's some glaring mistakes made. So yeah, it feels like that there was some good sort of kernel in that with Ishtar. I did quite like that idea, that kind of core idea of someone crashing down and trying to rebuild through some like mind-controlled population, a new civilization in her own making. Yeah, I do quite like you say, how it was done at the end, just about bringing in this new developed version. But like you say, it is mired and bogged down by everything else, bringing in that baggage. The way some of it is written in a quite a sort of formulaic way, it can be quite repetitive. But overall, I did quite like what they did with this film, and that end bit in the TARDIS did make me go, "Oh well, at least this looks like it'll be interesting in the next one, at least."
Yeah, and the idea that the Doctor's responsible for it, because there's some kind of dubiety about whether it's a self-fulfilling prophecy or if the Doctor's done this by being too arrogant and presumptuous about things. You're talking about John Peel obviously knowing his stuff and knowing his history. The fact that it was Tom Baker delivered this bit of information from back when the Centaureans first invaded Gallifrey is like...
And that's another one as well. Like we were saying about how, he wants to try and paint himself as this renounced fan with loads of mentions of the old series amongst it. But the way he describes the Fourth Doctor in that scene near the beginning in the TARDIS, he's wearing burgundy clothes and a burgundy scarf and all this red stuff like season 18. But then he's like, "Oh, come along, Leela," because he's at the end of like Invasion of Time or something. And that's not what the Doctor was. It's bizarre how small little details like that somehow are just not picked up on by what's meant to be a big fan.
And I can't believe I'm about to say this. In John Peel's defence, the world was a different place back then. We didn't have... The internet didn't exist to the same extent. The references books were quite thin in the ground. People were basing a lot of their Who lore on memory. So chances are he's pulled this out from his memories and he's been like maybe 80% accurate in it. He's been off just a wee bit. But again, it also highlights how little he was edited, because a decent editor would have caught that. I do wonder what the book would have been like if I had a decent editor in place. It may have been a bit more coherent, a bit more structured. It may have had a few things taken out of it, may have had a bit more substance in different areas. So they might have gone, are we sure sleeping with 13-year-olds is a good idea? We're a hell of a lucky the Daily Mail didn't get wind of this back in the time. They have a very White House-led campaign to get rid of Doctor Who books. When you think about issues Colin Baker had with his stuff, and you watch it now, there's like, this was deemed too violent. What if they'd read some of these books? It'd have been prophecy fulfilled. Look what Doctor Who's become. This is terrible. We're letting our children read this. And even then, there's no hint anywhere in the book that it's not suitable for younger audiences. I mean, wait, think about this, Alistair. You'd have been about... I would have been in my early 20s when these first came out. But I've been a Doctor Who fan for quite a while, so potentially 10-year-old me could have picked this up and gone, oh, I wonder what this is about. I can almost imagine the horror going through it and going, sorry, what? Sorry, what? The idea that young girls may have picked up as well and going, oh, is this normal behaviour? It's like, no, it's not. We got very lucky the general public don't know about Timewyrm.
Yeah, I mean, this is something actually I had a wee look into. So, how things were reported back in June of 1991 about this, and like you see, thankfully the Daily Mail didn't get in touch about this, but the Sun did do an article about it, and big entitled "Dr. Blue" was the headline of this, and it details all those salacious details that we have been chatting about in this book, and its bizarre adolescent idea of sex and such. But there was other examples at the time as well, because I was curious to see how fans at the time felt after 2 years away from Doctor Who finally getting some form of content. And it's been interesting because I was reading Doctor Who magazine issue 177 to see what the review was at the time of it. And I've been reading this review, I think it's by Gary Russell, and yeah, even by then, this one people were not a big fan of at the time. It's the things we've been talking about the way that they talk about sex, the way that they have literal 13-year-olds naked in this book, the way that some of the characterization of the Seventh Doctor is and Ace is compared to others, and the kind of barrier, I guess, that references like we were talking about with the Fourth Doctor and the Third Doctor and all this that could be a strong barrier to a new audience.
Mm.
And yeah, it's been interesting seeing that in Doctor Who magazine and other kind of contemporary reviews at the time, because you'd think Doctor Who fans would be like, oh, they mentioned John Pertwee and he's saying Liz and he's saying Sarah Jane, and you'd
Yeah.
think that would be titillating stuff for Doctor Who fans, but I think they were wise enough to realise this is
was
not a
not
way
the way
to
forward.
expand or maintain an audience.
Well, was it Craig Hinton that termed the phrase fan wank?
Yes.
That feels quite.
It's like an overexcited teenage fan writing anything that they can to hand, and that's what comes out in this book.
And I said before, John Peel said himself he just wanted to get the book out and be the first person to have done this. And it shows, John. No offence, it shows.
Yeah, it does. It does feel like it's not constrained in a way that's planned.
But on the same token, one of my favourite books in the range is So Vile a Sin by Kate Orman. And it is absolutely drowning in past references, but not to the point where you're pulled out of the story. It keeps you involved and keeps you going and keeps things moving around, and it'll throw the odd crumb out here to the long-time fans and then move on. So it can be done tastefully and properly, but just wasn't on this occasion.
Yeah.
The fact that he starts off straight away with, here's Tom Baker, and down the line there's John Pertwee, it's like he didn't feel Sylvester McCoy's Doctor was enough to carry this by itself. He had to throw in the other Doctors.
And to be honest, I've been reading the continuing adventures of the Timewyrm series for the next 3 ones, and Timewyrm Revelation, where that's a key point. It's about past Doctor adventures and such, and the Doctor, and it's can be used in a very smart way if you've got someone willing to find a smart way to do it. And it's because writers by then had a time to sit down and go, right, what do I want to do differently? What's a new thing that I could explore? Rather than just being excited that you're writing a new Doctor Who story and you're the first one doing it, which is what this provides for us, unfortunately.
And not getting too far ahead of ourselves, but Paul Cornell's Timewyrm Revelations it's a thing of beauty. I still love it. It's a brilliant, brilliant book, and I think it probably saved the range. It's just a shame you have to sit through the first 3 in the series before you get to that.
I would say, I'm spoiling ahead, I guess. Exodus, I find quite enjoyable. It's a nice traditional kind of romp for the most part of a Terrence Dicks thriller sort of idea.
It's what you expect from Uncle Terry. Yes, I have one particular sticking point with that, but that's one to come back to. By and large, it's a good alternative history World War II romp. If you can't trust Terrence Dicks with Doctor Who can you trust him?
And that's actually maybe an interesting thing I'd like to find out more about is, John Peel, naturally, like you've been saying, was adamant to be this first writer in that way. I'd want to know if is it Peter Darvill Evans who was the range overseer. I would wonder if he thought, right, we're having someone who's just keen as a bean, no idea how it will pan out, but he can do that. But we need a safe pair of hands to do the next bit. I think that's maybe why the next one went with Terrence Dicks in that way. So I'm happy they did, because it does provide that safe pair of hands for a book at least.
Make no bones about it, Paul Cornell saved the range if he hadn't done Timewyrm Revelation. But he was fairly unknown at that point, wasn't he? I don't think we'd ever seen Paul Cornell before that point.
I'm not too sure, actually. We'll actually discuss more in detail. I'll know a bit more about his history by then.
I think he was more involved in fanzines and all the rest of it beforehand.
I think he was within that sphere at that time. But, it's good that they were experimenting in other ways as well with getting people like him in, and thankfully they worked very, very well. Because otherwise, you don't want another John Peel, no offence to him.
No, who's still writing into that. He's doing Doctor Who adjacent stuff, just have to have a checked. Some kind of French equivalent.
But I don't see his style of writing being a dynamic way to continue a range like this in that way, especially like we're saying, with the way you've done that characterisation of the Doctor. How is he going to then? Is he going to just flippantly change it in his version again if he does a few books later and such? It's important to have some form of gradual build and planning with this range. especially since they initially tried that with the 4-parter and 3-parter books, where you're wanting to build that arc in some way.
I'm just trying to think, Matt, now. I think it's just the Timewyrm Quartet and the Cat's Cradle trilogy. It's like the only ones that are overtly marked as being sets, aren't they? All the rest are kind of loosely held together.
Yeah. There's other thematic flags, but this one's the only ones that are named, as it were, in this way.
I mean, there's loose connections later on because you've got Original Sin is obviously the Dove and Survivor Sin are bookends for each other, but there's no overt connections going forward. We see under some market research suggested to them that, people are seeing quartets and trilogies and they're panicking and aren't buying, find another way of doing it.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. Like, if you're expecting a range to be Doctor Who's series like this, Doctor Who just had its own adventures every so often. I've just, here's a story, here's the next story the next month, and within their 4-part stories and whatever. And that was the contained thing they did. And that sometimes might be the better way to try and draw other folk in. Yeah,
but at the same time, what I love about the new adventures is the overall arc. Now I've had time to sit down and get into it properly. It can get involved in epic in a way that the TV series just can't, because the TV series is meant to be a thing that you can tune into with the family. You can miss a couple, it's not a big deal. It's just good, solid family entertainment, one and done, 90% of the time. And that's absolutely as it should be. The books were a chance, the new adventures were a chance to try something different. And yeah, they're definitely different. And I remain quite a fan, but it can be hard to recommend them because you can't say start with Timewyrm. And you can't say start with Timewyrm Revelation because people will go, but it says book 4. Yeah, I know, but trust me, just you'll work it out. Yeah. There's not a lot of obvious jumping on points. Original Sin's possibly one.
Yeah, that's the thing that the series, like we were discussing earlier, with like Human Nature, like that is in itself a good story, but publishing that on its own, I am curious to know how, in particular, fans who are just picking it up because they liked the 2007 story find it, because you're just venturing into a different realm of Doctor Who completely when you're reading that in a lot of ways. So yeah, it'll be interesting seeing how people, and you're welcome to write in, whoever is listening, about how you found it and how you might find if you picked up books like that compared to the original series, compared to your experiences with Doctor in the past. It'll be interesting to know, because it's an oddity within the fandom. It's one that's never quite explored as much as other aspects of, say, like Big Finish or other spin-offs.
What I found is that New Adventures fans tend to be very, very passionate about it in a way that maybe the other sections aren't quite. It's a very all or nothing part of the fandom. You're either all in, you know all, or it's... Yeah, I heard Long Barrow was good.
Yeah.
It's New Adventures fans tend to be very, very passionate about it, and that's probably the biggest selling point for the thing. I didn't think when I first saw what that was book 9 back in the 90s, I didn't think I'd be talking about this still in the 2020s, and yet here we are.
It certainly has lasted, that 30 odd years of a range to still merit some discussion, and like we saw a few, 15 years ago now, but with the new series, when they pull ideas from it as well, it can be a place to pull interesting ideas for going forward. So it does have its place. It just needs to be understood a bit more, I think, and hopefully we'll be trying to do that with this podcast.
Yes, very much so. But talking about ideas, the copper inlays in the city of Kish, we saw that again in Pompeii, in the Fires of Pompeii. They had whole episode built around what was a small detail in Timewyrm, and it just shows you the ideas were there. They stand up to being recycled and reused, and people don't start shooting and bawling about, oh, we've seen this before, go away. It's like, oh, I remember this, or that's a good idea, or here's how it can be done. Well, there's always going to be a degree of recycling in Doctor Who, and it's fine.
Exactly. But on that note, I think it's exciting for us going forward to see those ideas, these original ideas in this range going forward. So I just want to say thanks very much, everyone, for listening. Thank you, Alasdair, for joining us.
Pleasure.
And hopefully we'll be joining next time. Hopefully we'll be chatting next time about Timewyrm Exodus.
Yes, looking forward to that one, Anthony.
See you all soon. Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Too Broad, Too Deep podcast. You can contact us on social media, on Instagram and Twitter at Too Broad, Too Deep Pod, and that's with the number 2. You can also email us at toobroadtoodeeppod@gmail.com, and that's with the word 2 spelled Too. Leave some comments with us about how you feel about the range and certain books of the Virgin New Adventures as we go along on this journey. Hope to hear from you soon.